Welcome to Free to Disagree's Communal Sense Podcast. I'm Amanda MacDonald. This is Treye Connor, and today we're going to talk about socialism. A little bit about it. Treye is having a kind of online thread crisis in which people are advocating for socialism without actually knowing exactly what it is. So I wanted Treye to talk a little bit about that.
Cool, yeah. So frequently in my discussions with people that advocate for socialism, both online and in person, like my friends, I have a lot of friends that support socialism, but whenever I talk about this stuff online or with my friends, they say they are a democratic socialist, which is cool, fine, you're free to be that. But whenever I ask them to articulate what exactly that is or what that means, they have trouble defining what it is. And I want to point out that socialism, whenever you're talking about socialism, it isn't just reallocating taxes from one area to another. So you're not just arguing, should we spend money on infrastructure or welfare instead of the military, because that's not by definition socialism. So I want to discuss today what socialism really is, and let's discuss like what it means to be a socialist. So if you want to advocate for democratic socialism, that's cool, that's great. But let's define exactly what is socialism, because I talk to these people and I ask them to define, can you please tell me the difference between democratic socialism versus socialism? Can you articulate what separates those two? And oftentimes I don't get a whole lot of really solid feedback. People generally don't know the difference between socialism and democratic socialism. So you know what it means to be democratic, and
Right.
It means that people can have a vote. It means that the people can participate. So it's not just a ruling class and then the people all just go along with whatever they choose. They get to participate, so they get to vote. So that's essentially what it means to be democratic. So whenever you tag that on to socialism, it's socialism where the people get to participate and get to vote and have a voice in the system. So whenever I ask them what's the difference between democratic socialism and socialism, they don't articulate that it's just socialism with a vote. They say, oh, it's spending our money on infrastructure, it's spending our money on healthcare, it's spending our money on this and this and this and this. But there's no differentiation between socialism and democratic socialism that way. Like socialism, yeah, you're spending your money on healthcare, you're spending your money on infrastructure just like you would in democratic socialism. So what's the difference here? I think what people are missing is they're missing the essence of what it means to be socialist. Because whenever you're saying, I am a socialist, you're not arguing we should reallocate taxes. What you're arguing is who owns the means of production. And so Marx has a statement in the Communist Manifesto, and I realize socialism is not communism. I realize that. But he has a statement in the Communist Manifesto that the communism can be stated in one singular sentence, and that is the abolition of private property. So whenever you're discussing communism, you're discussing who owns the means of production, and again, it's stated right there, there's no more private property. The people don't privately own this property, as in people don't own the factories, own the businesses, own the water, whatever, wherever we get our water from. People don't own these things. It's the government owns these things, or the people own these things. Now, with communism, though, as Marx stated, communism is the end goal of socialism. Socialism is a transitionary period to communism. So it's a transition of the means of production. It's not just let's spend our taxes here, let's spend our taxes here. It's a discussion of who owns the means of production.
Yeah, I see democratic socialism as kind of like a euphemism for Leninist Marxism. So Marxism arrived in Russia in about the 1880s, and Lenin had to, after the October Revolution, kind of reformulate Marxism to figure out a way to justify the revolution, as the revolution was done by a vanguard of professional revolutionaries, the Bolsheviks, as opposed to the working class proletariat. And so in order to kind of justify the October Revolution and justify the rule of the Bolsheviks, Lenin had to make some changes to Marxism, some fundamental changes to make it acceptable for the public and kind of allow for a hope of communism to continue to materialize across the country. Yep. And so basically what happened was he was known as like a famous propagandist and a famous organizer, right? But in his organizational capacity of the new government, he essentially said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to recreate a communist party, and we're going to allow that communist party to make democratic decisions of who then is at the upper echelon of the party. And the individuals at the upper echelon of the party are the ones who are actually going to make all of the decisions. So the democratic piece is that you get to choose who your talking head is, but that doesn't mean that you get to choose what policy you get, right? So the people who are calling themselves democratic socialists in America today, I initially thought that this was kind of like an okay term, but it seems to me now that it's, like I said before, a complete euphemism for democratic centralization of the Communist Party. So what they're trying to do is take the hard left leaning Democrats and make them into an acceptable socialist wing of the party that has this democratic piece to it because you get to elect who your talking head is to the government. But once the talking head makes the decision, basically, just as Lenin did, the whole party better fall in line and say, this is what we want. We're a unified party. So this to me is like kind of the split that's between the Democratic Party right now, between the hard left-leaning people and the more moderate or more central-leaning Democrats. It seems to me like the insertion of this term is exactly the line drawn in the metaphorical sand of where the separation is going to be. And I see the Democratic Party splitting over this because traditional Democrats, they don't believe in socialism in the same sense. They still believe in private property, just like Elizabeth Warren does.
Yes,
but Elizabeth Warren is taking some kind of new tact in which she's saying that maybe money isn't property. And this is something that John Locke talked about in his 2 treatises of government. And it was like, okay, if one person allocates a whole bunch of money, is that any harm to you? So if I allocated a bunch of money, is that any harm to Treye? And the ending conclusion was basically, well, because money can't actually waste, then no, it is of no harm to Treye whether Amanda has a lot of money, because Treye, through private property and liberty, still has the ability to go out into the world and to make money for himself. But things that Elizabeth Warren is trying to do that kind of cut against that is taxes, where she's trying to change the definition of property to not apply to money, so that would allow her to be able to access tax revenues to reallocate those taxes toward, instead of say military defense, toward homeless shelters or Medicare or Social Security or something along those lines, free college and elimination of student debt. And so it seems to me that it's really kind of a parallel perversion of communism. And it's one small step that is going to get us just one step away from actual socialism in America.
I agree. With your point that democratic socialism is a euphemism for socialism, because as I was saying, I talk to these people and I say, well, you're a socialist. And they say, no, I'm a democratic socialist. Or I'll talk about socialism. I'll say, this is what socialism is. And people will say, no. That's not democratic socialism. Democratic socialism is this. And so that's why I keep trying to figure out, like, what is the distinction between democratic socialism and socialism? Because I keep saying, all right, well, this is socialism. And they're like, no. We're talking about democratic socialism is different. So
That's the difference between Marxism and Marxist-Leninism. In my view,
right.
It's the same.
But it's essentially the same thing.
Yeah,
it's
the
built
parallel
off
of the same thing.
Fundamental principles. So, again, the fundamental principle is the abolition of private property, and you can see this actually. You can Google Bernie nationalization, and you can check all the different news sources. If you don't like Fox News, fine, you can see it on CNN. If you don't like CNN, fine, you can see it on ABC, MSNBC, et cetera. The list goes on. So Bernie Sanders' idea was he wants to nationalize the energy sector, and this is for the Green New Deal. So in order to get the Green New Deal to actually come about and be, what he wants to do is he wants to nationalize the energy sector. And what this means is whenever you nationalize something, you take it out of the hands of private property or private owners, and you put it in the hands of the government. So the government owns it. So you can actually see nationalization with like the post office. Like the government runs the post office, and the profit from the post office goes directly to the government. And what this would look like is, instead of, say, Microsoft being owned by Bill Gates and all that money that goes into Microsoft funneling up and up and up and up into Bill Gates' pocket, it would just funnel up and up and up to the owner, who is the government. And so if we nationalize the energy sector, all that money that'll go, instead of to a private owner, whoever owns the electric companies or the oil companies, it'll go into the pockets of the government. And at that point, all that money will accumulate, and then they'll take it and sprinkle it back onto the economy. So say with infrastructure, they'll put it into roads, put it into buildings and stuff like that. But first, it all goes up and up and up and up, accumulates at the government where they redisperse it. But that's oftentimes where the corruption of socialism comes from, because one of the arguments of socialists is that capitalists are inherently greedy, and it actually feeds off of innate human greed. But if their argument is that humans are inherently greedy and all that money funneling up to people comes from greed, if humans are inherently greedy, what do you think the government consists of? The government consists of people, just as rich people are people, and this whole system consists of people. And if you're making the argument that people are greedy and all that wealth
stands to reason the government's greedy too.
Yeah. Right. Like these people are the same thing. They're just as greedy as the rich people are, and all that money accumulating up at the government, because the government would own everything. That's the point of socialism, is it's the transition of who owns the means of production. And so if the government owns everything, all these businesses, when the money funnels up to the government, it accumulates there, and that's where you consistently always get all of this corruption, like you were talking about earlier in the USSR, Venezuela, North Korea.
Yep.
And it's like...
And there are like examples of this all over different histories of socialism or authoritarian or totalitarian governments. Like we were talking about before, how North Korea is a great example of a totalitarian government, and they have kind of this socialist structure in which the government pretty much owns everything. And if you haven't noticed, Kim Jong-un is pretty well off in his body structure. You can tell that he eats every day. Right? You can tell that he eats every day, whereas the majority of his population actually isn't eating every day. They're starving. Yep. And this is something that occurs even in African countries, like I was talking about before, because in African countries they participate in a system called neo-patrimonialism, where it's a new patrimonial relationship in which an African strongman is elected to X country in Africa, and once he maintains the executive, he will hire and appoint friends and family to positions of power so that the family can directly benefit from the government position. And in Africa, like in other countries like the Soviet Union before 1991, like North Korea today, like China, a lot of these countries, Venezuela, a lot of these countries have the same problem, in which once powerful people are put into the top, and once the government owns those means of production, then the guy who is in charge of the energy sector can just skim money off the top of oil, and it's no harm, no foul. Right, but that's why corruption is rampant in those countries, because, they have all of it, and there's no one to hold them to account to say, actually, this is what we need over here. And so what ends up happening is you have individuals taking large sums of money or large portions of the market or the sector, reallocating it to themselves, and then the individuals that are left in that sector, whether it be energy, transportation, infrastructure, any of those things, say you needed more trains so that you could transport natural resources like they had to do in the Soviet Union. If you needed more trains, you have to be able to build the railroad, right? But if somebody's skimming off the top, then perhaps the railroad construction doesn't actually get all of the sources allocated to it that it actually needs. It gets something else, maybe a lesser amount, maybe timber instead of steel, or something along those lines that kind of fundamentally changes the quality or the durability of whatever product is being created by the state. So this is called a command economy, where it's centrally planned by the government. And so the government will go in and they'll talk to the heads of all the energy sectors, who have talked to all the distributors, who have talked to all the managers, who have talked to all the workers. And then they determine in each market, okay, we need 100,000 pairs of shoes. But in a command economy, once the plan is put into place, the argument for supply and demand goes out the window. So if more teens, for example, are wearing out the amount or the shoes that they're wearing, and they all need like a size 6 or a size 7, but the planned economy is stating that adults are going to run out of pairs of shoes, so they actually need size 9. Then when 100,000 shoes get made that are all size 9, the government says, too bad, so sad, supply and demand really doesn't mean anything here. And this...
Right, because it's not based off of supply and demand.
Right,
it's
exactly.
It's not answering a demand with the supply. It's simply going off the plan.
Right. And this was a huge problem in the Soviet Union because they had rampant black markets in which people wouldn't actually participate in their command economy. They would go out and trade with each other privately on the black market, which is a free market, by the way. And
really mess up the whole plan.
Right, and really mess up the whole plan. But the black market was, advocating for supply and demand because it was based on trade between people, right, instead of just the government telling you what you need.
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
100%.
Right.
Little known fact, North Korea is actually a democratic socialist republic. Little do people know. It's right on their constitution. It's called Juche, I think, is their philosophy. And it's literally just democratic socialism. People don't know that. It's right on the front of their constitution. Look it up.
Which is crazy. Like, what is... Because as far as I understand anything, which is almost nothing about North Korea, like, when do they vote? Like, they don't vote on anything. Is democratic just like a staple word or something?
They do vote, but if I remember correctly, Kim Jong-un got 100% of the votes.
Oh, right, right. This is another problem that happens in, like, command economies where the party, being the Democratic Socialists in the case of America, or the Bolsheviks in the case of the Soviet Union, or the Communists in the case of the Soviet Union, when the party overlaps the government to the point where there's almost no independent government, like a government bureaucracy that isn't controlled by the party, then basically what ends up happening is the vote is doctored for everyone, and this is famous in the USSR. They would doctor all of their votes and voter turnout and say there was 90% voter turnout, but if they didn't vote for, and they only have like, the way that it works, it's like a hierarchical structure. And then the party will say, okay, we're going to have these 7 people for these 7 positions vote. And the only time that you vote against them is just to simply vote no. You can't vote for an opposition candidate because there is no opposition candidate. It's this guy or no one at all. And so, in order to say no on your ballot in the Soviet Union, you would have to go into a voting ballot box, which would just call attention to yourself anyways. So people who did vote never voted no because the party would move against you if you did vote no. And otherwise, if everyone happened to vote no on a particular subject, they would just doctor the results and then put out exactly what the party wanted to put out. And that's something that I see possible in a Democratic Socialist Party government because of the just straight up ideological bearing that the party has over its people. So, like I was talking to this guy on Facebook the other day, and he was saying, I gave you 4 sources that prove that Biden was investigated twice for his Burisma connections. And it was hilarious because in each of these 4 articles, it only stated that the previous government of Ukraine investigated him, which is the government that's charged with horrendous amounts of corruption. And so the prosecutor that was supposed to be looking over the case and overseeing the case was paid off. And that's how the investigation ended. And they were like, oh, we didn't find anything here. And I'm just kind of like, well, obviously you didn't find anything. That doesn't prove the guilt or innocence of the Bidens. All it proves is that the Ukrainian government is obviously corrupt at that point in time.
And what can you do whenever they're corrupt? You can't really do anything. And that's the big problem. Like, that's why socialism goes corrupt so many times, because who has control of everything? Well, the government has control of everything. If they own the means of production, if they own all the businesses, if they own everything, there's not a whole lot you can do. I mean, even if it is corrupt, what are you going to do? Are you going to revolt? Well, good luck with that. Look at North Korea.
Right. How are you going to revolt if you can't even feed yourselves because you're dependent upon the government doing it for you? Right.
But, I mean, I'm not going to sit here and say North Korea is corrupt, therefore the United States will become corrupt. But I'm simply saying this is the mechanics behind it. It's the government owns everything. Everything funnels up to the government, and then eventually we can move on where the government gives up the control and we don't even need the government anymore. Right. But for that middle stage in between capitalism and communism, the transitionary period of socialism is when the government owns everything. They own the means of production. And like I was saying, Bernie Sanders already advocating to nationalize the energy sector, to nationalize 30% of the Americans' economy. And that's, like I said, you can look that up. That's fact. That's what Bernie Sanders out of his own mouth said. That's not my interpretation of it. That's not some fringe theory. Bernie Sanders himself said, let's nationalize the energy sector. And why are they doing this? Because of the Green New Deal. Mm-hmm. The Green New Deal focuses on global warming, and it's a big crisis. And they say, okay, well, we need to do something. And so if we accept the idea that the world is doomed essentially in 10 to 20, 30 years from global warming, then we can give up that power and say, okay, we'll handle it. So go ahead and nationalize the energy sector, because that's where the carbon's coming from, is the factories, the oil, the natural gases and stuff. That's where most of our carbon is coming from. So if people are scared enough from global warming, climate change, they will opt for the idea for the Green New Deal. Let's go ahead and get rid of all this so that way we can stop global warming. And then that's where Bernie Sanders says, all right, let's nationalize this.
It's amazing, though, because we just, like, you always hear the argument, well, that wasn't real socialism, or that wasn't real communism. That wasn't the real application of it. And it's kind of funny to me, because if you go all the way back to Marxist-Leninism, Lenin was a devout Marxist. Like, he said that. In the 1880s, he was like, I'm a Marxist. Yeah, right? 100%. And he applied fundamental changes to Marxism for himself. And Stalin did the same thing. And almost everybody after them did the same thing, so that they could try to change the direction of Russia, so they could force the Soviet Union into the perfect communist utopia. But if you go back and you read Das Kapital, or you read the Communist Manifesto, what you find is Marx saying capitalism is a necessary step in order to get to communist, or to get to socialism, to get to the communist utopia. And it's hilarious to me, because people are like, we need to abolish capitalism and move away from all of this stuff. And it's like, well, actually, if you were a real Marxist, you would allow capitalism to completely run its course. Because just like the evolution of society, just like the evolution of people, or the evolution of an idea, Marxism, if you want it to actually be successful, it needs to naturally evolve. We need to have the technological innovation required to get us to a point where we don't need to work, because we have AI, self-driving cars, because something else other than a human being is creating our crop yields for us, you know? Yeah. In order for us to participate in free creative labor. So, like, if you're a true communist, you wouldn't diss capitalism, because it's absolutely what you need. You can't go from primitive communism to absolute communism in a single solitary step. And trying to force that in a top-down way is a surefire way to assure destruction of your entire community, whether that's through mass starvation because you're trying to do a planned economy, which, by the way, the government's not very good at a lot, except for taking money, waging war, and
wasting our tax
Yeah,
dollars.
and wasting tax dollars basically is that's a pretty good summation of what the government is actually good at. But what the government's not good at is creating a top-down policy that allocates to everyone. It doesn't work. And every time we've tried it, it doesn't work. So I don't understand where that comes from. Oh, it's not real socialism. It's like... Marxist-Leninism isn't real Marxism either.
Well, it never is, because there's always corruption that gets in the way 10 times out of 10. But I think there's an important distinction to be made here. And another rebuttal I hear too is, oh, that's not social, or that's not democratic socialism. Yada yada. I also hear it with Marxism. Whenever you discuss Marx, they say, well, that's Marxism, that's not socialism. Marxism is socialism. They're the same thing. So someone came along after Marx released all his theories and created the term socialism. And he made the term socialism from, I think it was called critical Marxist theory or critical Marxist analysis. And after reading that, he coined the term socialism from Marxist theory. It's derived from Marxist theory. Socialism is inherently Marxism. Marx came out with his theories, and that's where we have socialism. Socialism is derived from Marxism. There's no distinction or separation there.
And the primary difference between communism and socialism, then, is that communism is the absolute realization of the utopia in which government dwindles away. That's how Marx said we would know communism arrived, is because the state would fall away.
Yeah.
We wouldn't need it anymore,
Yeah.
because we would be able to participate in free creative labor for the community without ever having to be able to kind of look to the government to tell us what to do, which means that all the democratic socialists that are out there touting these ideas are actually touting for the complete opposite of what their ideas are supposed to be. And I'm seeing this everywhere on the left. Anybody who participates, and I don't mean to pick on the left, like I'm socially left for a lot of things. Like, I believe in gay rights. I believe in abortion. I'm iffy on the death penalty in a lot of ways. I do think that it's specifically reserved for people who are of a particular kind of evil. But I'm socially left leaning. When it comes to government and policy, I fall a little bit more to the right. But either way, that makes me a centrist at best. Right? And it's kind of like, what I don't understand about the left right now is every single time I look to any argument that is a postmodern argument for X policy or for X approach to government, it is distorting the historical definitions of things and kind of recharacterizing them as something else, and they're using the negative attribution to argue for a positive change. And it's like, well, right, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't wash at all.
They come out with the term democratic socialism. Like, what even is that? Like,
it's like peanut butter and jelly. Like, what are you talking about?
Right. It's like, you're so right. They are distorting things because they come out with democratic socialism.
And it sounds like it goes together like peanut butter and jelly, but peanut butter and jelly are both totally different things when they're by themselves, you know?
Yeah, and they're advocating for... it's exactly it. They're advocating for something that it's not.
It's like the historical opposite. So if you look at the 1619 Project, right? And I'm planning on doing a podcast with Brent on this sometime into the future. But the individuals who are advocating the 1619 Project, which is basically saying that they want to change the founding of the country from 1776 to 1619, when for the first 50 slaves arrived to the United States, they're literally using anti-abolition arguments from chattel slavery to say that we should change the founding of the country to honor the slaves. They're using pro-slavery arguments to argue why slavery is important in the United States. I've looked this up. There's a great guy. His name is... I don't even think that they're doing it on purpose. I think there's just no real historical knowledge. Like, they use the King Cotton thesis to say that the King Cotton thesis was a pro-slavery argument that said, look, the Chattel South produces all of this cotton, which allows us to be king in the global economy when we're trading with France, Britain, whatever, and it gives us a leg up on them, essentially, right? But if you go back into the history and you really look at it, cotton only accounts for, I think, maybe 15% of the labor force in our actual overall GDP, which is a pretty decent amount, but that's definitely not carrying the entire economy.
Right.
It's not.
It's not the only thing.
Right, exactly. There are other factors to be considered there. And that's what pro-slavery, that's what plantation holders would say to justify slavery in the South when we just on the eve of the Civil War, you know, and it's like, how did you just reverse that to talk about that?
Yeah.
And now they're doing the same thing, democratic socialism with Leninist Marxism, even though it directly conflicts with Marxism when Marx said, let capitalism run its course. It's all antithetical. Postmodernism is basically oppositism, in my view. And that's really what it boils down to.
It's the idea that there's no objective truth, so you can make it to be whatever you want it to be.
Right. So history doesn't matter. We're just going to take our feeling of what history looked like, and we're going to call that. We're going to take our inferences from history, and instead of kind of really looking and studying critically the history of any one given country, we're gonna make some inferences and some assumptions, and then we're gonna call those facts. And that's terrifying to me, because then people can say nothing is true.
Well,
and if nothing is true, then everything is false.
Yeah.
And if everything is false, then nobody has any reason to be moral to each other anymore. So what ends up happening is people don't participate in relationships in the same way of good faith, because it's all fake anyways.
And speaking of distorting things too, this whole global warming thing, I'm sorry to say it, but is honestly socialist propaganda. Like, that's what it boils down to, that's all that it is. They're trying to take something that, okay, the climate is changing, and if they can distort it enough, make it terrifying enough, then once people are scared, they can implement, like I was saying, the nationalizing of the energy sector, and they twist and contort it. But if you look at the actual data of global warming, and I'm going to say this before we even get into it, I do think that humans are causing some climate change.
Definitely.
We are the source of a lot of these things changing. So before we even get into that, let me state that, like, yes, climate change is real. Yes, humans are causing it. But if you look at the data, and don't look at Fox News, don't look at CNN, don't look at any news, because all the news is propaganda. Go look at the actual data. Just go search climate change projections, global warming projections, and you can see, and you'll see the graphs for 100 years out. So what is the world going to look like in 2100? And if you look at the graphs, there's so much margin of error. So 10 years out, whenever we look at the graph, 10 years out, the margin of error is like this big. But then you go 20 years out and it's this big. And whenever you finally go 100 years, it's like this big. They have no idea where it's going to land. They have no way of predicting if it's going to go way up here or way down here. So the people look at these graphs and they say, well, first off, they say that it's going to be way up here. And they say that with absolute certainty, like, we are going to destroy the world. So that's very disingenuous, because if you look at the margin of error for you to state that we will for sure certainly be up here, it's ridiculous, because you have like maybe a 1% chance of landing up here as opposed to down here, because the margin of error is so big, it's so uncertain.
Right,
so
because the inability to be able to accurately predict beyond 10 years compounds itself over time.
Yeah.
And then you get into the point where you're just shooting an arrow into the dark, and then you're trying to predict where it lands.
Right. And then they're being disingenuous with it, saying that we will for sure be way up here. So we don't even know that, first off. And then second off, if you look at the 100-year projection, again, not looking at the news, go look at the actual data, look at the graphs. I looked at graph after graph after graph of original data straight from these studies, and you can look, and on the high point where the margin of error ends on the high end, it's only going to be like maybe 4, 5, 6 degrees Celsius on average hotter than we are now by the year 2100. So not 10 years from now, not 20. By the time we reach 2100, will have raised 4, 5, maybe 6 degrees Celsius average. And is that the end of the world? Absolutely not. So that's just an average of a little bit hotter everywhere, which means the colder places are a little bit warmer, which also means that forests start sprouting up and popping up, which is happening because up north where the ice is melting and the snow is going away, where it is getting a little bit warmer, there's starting to be a whole bunch of forests popping up and a bunch of trees popping up. And
right, because they were buried under the ice prior. Exactly.
And you know what trees are made of? Carbon. So they're starting to soak up all this carbon, breathe in all the carbon dioxide from the air, and filter it out back into oxygen already naturally. So as things heat up, yes, some of the ice will melt, but we're going to start seeing more forests, and nobody predicted that. So nobody saw, okay, the world's going to heat up, and they thought it was going to be destruction, but all of a sudden now there's new forests, and they didn't predict that. And another thing, also with this whole global warming thing too, we've recently come out with carbon capture technology, and it captures over 80% of the carbon emitted from factories. So big energy factories that are burning things to produce energy, they have carbon capture technology, and all the carbon emitted from the factory is now being captured, and it's not being released into the environment, and they actually use the carbon captured to make more energy. So it captures the carbon and makes more energy, and it releases hardly any carbon anymore because it captures it all. So what they didn't predict is for the last 10 years now, the U.S. has been steadily decreasing their carbon emissions per person. So each person, the amount of carbon that they release has been going down for the last 10 years, and nobody predicted that because the technology advanced. We didn't first see that suddenly a new piece of technology would come out and essentially eliminate the carbon emissions from factories, but here we are. And as we go on further, with technology increasing further, there's going to be less and less and less and less and less carbon emitted as technology progresses further and further and further. Nobody predicted that. So these graphs, again, like I was saying with the margin of error, it's hard to predict these things. Nobody predicted that we come out with carbon capture technology, that the U.S. would lower its carbon emissions per person per year over the last 10 years. Nobody predicted this. So for them to say this is what it's going to be is ridiculous. And even if it was going to be that, that's not the end of the world. Believe me, we're not going to die. All of us die if the average temperature goes up 4 or 5 degrees Celsius. That's not the end of the world. That's not destruction. Places are just a little bit warmer, and there's going to be more habitable places. And they also are not predicting the technological progress that we might have and are already having. So I think it's highly disingenuous. It's definitely a piece of propaganda, and what they're trying to do is, with the Green New Deal, is socialism. It's just nationalizing the energy sector, transferring it from private ownership to government ownership, so that way they can put their socialist foot in the door. That's all that it is. The more people think that we're going to die from global warming, the more likely they are to vote socialist, and that's all it is a piece of propaganda.
Well, I don't necessarily think of it as a piece of propaganda, not because I don't think that it could be, but mostly because I'm more interested in I try to attribute as much good faith as I can to say that there are a lot of people in the world who really think that this is a bad thing. And instead of calling them a propagandist, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say, okay, I understand and you believe. I get it. Because I believe to a certain point and degree as well. Humans are definitely the cause of it. It's definitely happening. But I'm kind of in your camp, in which we can't really predict where we're going to be in 100 years because we can't predict technological innovation and we can't predict the complex changing ecology that's happening around us. What I find interesting, though, talking about getting the socialist foot in the door and giving all the money to these government oligarchs, it's like, who do you think these oligarchs are? Exactly. Like, you want to go ahead and give the government all of this free reign to nationalize the energy sector.
Yeah.
Who do you think is going to be making those decisions?
Yeah,
it's going to be the guy who's head of ExxonMobil. It's going to be the guy who's the head of Shell. It's going to be the guy who owns the most gas refineries in any given country. It's going to be those guys who are going to be making the decisions about nationalizing things. And so when people talk about being socialist for the sake of the little guy, it's kind of like, well, not really. You're actually worse than a capitalist, because at least a capitalist will identify that your individual property rights are more important than that oligarch's rights ability to nationalize a certain sector of the economy. And for me, it's again arguing for the opposite. It's oppositism, right? Yeah. They're saying, okay, we want to give all of our money to these government oligarchs and all of the power to these government oligarchs, and then they turn around and say we should tax the 1% because they're not going to look out for us. And it's like, what? Who do you think these lobbyists are that you're fighting against?
Right.
Who do you think the 1% really is? What do you think they do all day? They're certainly not sitting at home in their mansion doing nothing with all of their money. They're going to business meetings. They're talking about the next big project, and they're putting stuff out into the world. So if you really wanted to stick it to the big government oligarchs and the lobbyists who have all of this money and own everything, then you would own your own property and take care of it and be charitable in yourself and for your community.
Yeah, 100%. You know? And it's like, if you condemn,
makes no sense to me.
If you condemn the 1% for their greediness and you want to transfer, okay, so all the 1% has the money, so we take it away from the 1% and give it to another group, which is the government. What makes you think that they'd be any better than the 1% if the 1%?
Or what makes you think they're different?
Yeah.
What makes you think those are two separate groups of people?
Exactly.
Because they're not. They're the same exact people.
You're going to run into the same problems of greed and self-interest and whatnot. It's going to be the same thing. It's
right, except you also gave them the keys to the castle instead of keeping the door over the moat up.
Yeah.
You know?
Right.
Drives me nuts.
Like, if you're so scared of a small group of people having all the money, why on earth would you argue, let's give a small group of people all the money? It's the oppositism thing.
Exactly.
You're arguing the same thing.
It's rephrasing something and then arguing for the worst part of it.
Yeah, you're arguing for exactly what you're arguing against.
Right. Exactly. But it's rampant on the left. If you talk about climate change, if you talk about gun control, if you talk about social or democratic socialism, if you talk about communism, if you talk about postmodernism, critical race theories, fat studies, grievance studies, all of these things, they argue the opposite and call it truth.
And
it's crazy.
I'm with you on what you said. I think these people like genuinely are concerned and they do believe it.
Sure.
But I think
if nothing's true,
I think that they've been duped. I think they've been tricked. Look, if we look at Greta Thunberg,
Thunberg, I think, yeah.
Greta Thunberg, she is genuinely passionate about climate change.
And there's nothing wrong with that.
No, not at all. And I don't think that the people around her have brainwashed her, but I believe that she is genuinely terrified about global warming, and that's what she truly believes, and that's great. That's good for her. So she's right that we need to do something about it because global warming is real. Humans really are contributing to it. She's correct in that, but she's incorrect in the fact that she thinks that we aren't already doing something. Like I said, carbon capture technology.
Right.
Like
that kind of stuff kills me.
Like I said, last 10 years, the carbon emissions per person has gone down. So it's just a lot of fear out there, but it's unnecessary fear. And
also, like, at what point ever have human beings approached a problem, have approached the unknown of some kind of situation, and have not been fearful of the result? The answer is never. That's never happened because human beings are by nature fearful because we want to be able to survive, right? But that fear at the same time creates a lot of ability for human innovation because we're like, we need to know what the heck is out there, so we need to develop some kind of tools to figure out how to tackle this problem. And that's what we've been doing. The only qualm that I have with Greta, or however you say her name, Greta, is that not that she's 16 and she's an advocate, not that she, is particularly passionate or can't do anything without a script. My qualm with her is that she is only complaining. There are 16-year-olds who are also environmental activists that are inventing new technology. And if she took all of the FaceTime that she has with the United Nations, with whomever, and all of the money she's getting in donations, and instead refunded it back into other 16-year-olds that are trying to change the world with new inventions and technology, she would be the environmental Bill Gates. And she'd be able to say a lot more for herself other than I complained to the United Nations one time, which, I mean, it's great that she went to the United Nations and like made them aware, but it's not like world leaders haven't been aware of this since like the 50s.
I have no problem with her. I have a problem with the people that are using her. And what I mean is not people, she's not being manipulated. What I'm talking about is the news. Look, all these people take her
they
story.
Use her as a tool.
Yes. They take her story. They take the fact that she went and talked to these people, and the minute that she did it, all the leftist news could not wait. They were just sitting there dancing around. Oh, finally, and then they could put it out. Every single one of them, BuzzFeed, Huffington Post, CNN, MSNBC, ABC, yada yada, Young Turks, yada yada. All of them were posting about it. Why? Because they want to peddle this narrative. They want to peddle the fear. They want people to be scared, because if they're scared, then they vote for the Green New Deal. They vote for socialism. They vote, and these people get their way. What I'm upset about with her is not her, but it's all the people behind her hoisting her up and pushing her down the right's throat, making people scared, using her as a fear-mongering tactic, and just using her.
Right.
And I'm not saying that the people around her are using her, but you cannot argue and tell me that CNN is not using her. Because look, go to CNN's page. You'll see that all the people behind her have used her and pushed her narrative, and they're posting about her. So therefore, they are using her. CNN is using her. All these people are using her and her story and her voice to push their narrative and to push fear onto people. And now people are scared of global warming because of this. And if you go to the comment section, so many people, oh my God, the world's going to be destroyed. Da, 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 da. But I'm telling you, go look at the data. It's nothing like you think it is.
It's not as like earth crushing as you think it is.
Not at all.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, thanks for coming over and talking to me. I appreciate it.
Definitely.
All right.